Latin America, the Spanish and Portuguese Western Hemisphere, with its vast geography to its diverse melting pot of cultures, movement is nothing new for people here in the region. The magnitude of cultural and economic norms would have been unthinkable without the involvement of global forces between movements and conflicts. Christopher Columbus's first step in the Caribbean islands would become a historical turn for wealth and power for the world. Once the Spanish and Portuguese settled on their lands, they started to use the region's resources to cultivate their crops and to influence the indigenous populations. By the time the colonies became independent, how could they build themselves up? That question is still being answered by many Latin American countries today through violence and conflict.
It's action-packed.
It's dynamic. It's explosive.
This is Latin America. Christopher Columbus, the explorer that sparked the fire of movement and conflict throughout Latin America. He was destined to find a new route to Asia. He would convince the rulers of Spain to fund his voyage. Little did he know, he would end up giving his business country an even bigger surprise.
Columbus and his fellow men would land in the Caribbean islands in 1492. Although people have already lived there for thousands of years, Columbus would end up claiming the land as his own. With the number of valuable resources such as corn, bananas, and potatoes that he brought back to Europe, Spain and nearby Portugal would turn their eyes towards Latin America to take as much land as they can. With the richness that the New World provided, it would turn into the Columbian Exchange that would provide business benefits for centuries.
With the Iberian Peninsula getting excited by the discovery, the Pope had to make a truce to keep the peace. So both crowns signed the Treaty of Tordesillas, roughly dividing the region at the Brazilian border. Spain and Portugal would then quickly set up their colonies in the New World.
Once the Spanish and Portuguese settled into the new land, they would teach the natives about their religion, Roman Catholicism. They hired missionaries that tried to convert the native people to Christianity, building their influence on the motherland. From all this conquest, this would be the reason why people would speak Spanish or Portuguese today and religiously follow the Catholic faith.
Even though the Columbian Exchange was a huge moneymaker, something ugly will later come as a result for the Latin American colonies. The Columbian Exchange not only led to a profit for the Old World, it's also how diseases like smallpox, malaria, and yellow fever wiped out nearly 90% of all the indigenous populations. Any survivors were left enslaved by the Spanish or Portuguese to work in their plantations or search for gold. Most natives would also be unfitting to work due to the extreme heat and hard labor. With the native population declining, they turned their eyes to Africa for replacement workers.
A byproduct that came from the Columbian Exchange was the triangular trade. Indigenous or African slaves would start cultivating their different crops like rice, cotton, indigo, and sugarcane in the colonies. These resources would then be shipped to Europe to make into finished goods. These goods would be then shipped to Africa that can be traded for more slaves to the New World. It was an efficient trading cycle until the early 19th century.
The leg that connected Africa to the Americas was known as the Middle Passage. Men, women, and children were captured in warfare and loaded into cargo ships like luggage. The excruciating journey would take months, with 15% of captives perishing on board. From the early 1500s to the 1800s, the transatlantic slave trade transported 12 to 15 million Africans to the New World.
Once the Africans settled in the New World, most worked on the sugar plantations. However, there were some Africans that ran away or even fought back against their masters. Once they escaped, they would build their own societies. For example, some Afro-Latinos hid in the mountains where they had their own hierarchy, economic system, and even made their own music. In fact, it's where some genres like samba, reggaeton, and tango music got its start.
As more historical records appeared during the 20th century, it became an indication of how much Africans were a key contributor for the buildup of Latin America. The transatlantic slave trade and the Columbian Exchange made the Iberian Peninsula fabulously rich. However, it would soon begin unraveling.
The early 1800s was a ragged time for the Spanish and Portuguese because they were fighting against France in the Napoleonic Wars. Seeing this as a distraction, the colonies saw it as an opportunity to start the quest for independence. Revolutionaries like Simón Bolívar, Miguel Hidalgo, and José de San Martín were all empowered by the Enlightenment and wanted to prove that they can make a democracy a reality for Latin America.
From the Battle of Boyacá in Colombia to the Battle of Monte de las Cruces in Mexico, victories piled up for the colonies. Martín would give the final push to drive the remaining Spanish forces from the continent. Despite the colonies now gaining their independence, the only question left for them to answer is, now what? Despite the colonies obtaining their freedom, it wouldn't turn into peace and harmony. The years following would start becoming chaotic and violent. Each country in Latin America continuously fought with each other and amongst themselves. Most political leaders that came into power would be assassinated or overthrown. Gaps between the rich and the poor grew. With all this chaos, people in Latin America were desperate for change. By the early 20th century, one ideology that seemed like a possible solution was communism.
Communism is an economic system where the government owns the means of production and fairly distributes the wealth to every citizen. It does sound like a good theory, but it gives the government too much power. They ultimately thought that this is a game plan where everyone would guarantee equality for everyone, although it became the opposite of what was proposed.
One country that was notorious for a communist uprising was Cuba. Seeking to find reality in the system, Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, and communist revolutionaries overthrew the US-backed government. The United States was also involved in the Cold War to stop communism from spreading, and was ill-prepared when they tried to take the government back in the Bay of Pigs invasion. The Soviet Union would begin building missile bases in Cuba until President John F. Kennedy blocked the supply ships in the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Even after the Soviets agreed to move the missile bases, the United States and Cuba still have a rocky relationship with each other. It shows how much communism can hurt not only the individualized country, but other trading partners as well. Other countries have implemented embargoes on Cuba to pressure them to change their behavior.
Unfortunately, Cuba isn't the only country in Latin America that continues to struggle with money management. Along with Cuba, Latin America is still plagued by poverty and drug trafficking. The thing that ties all of it together is that most Latin American countries have struggled controlling the distribution of wealth between its citizens. It isn't helped by the fact that the region has a lack of highly skilled opportunities, access to education, or high-quality technology. Even with Brazil being one of the biggest growing economic countries in the region, Latin America has a high rate of poverty that affects a third of the region. That's more than 200 million people.
Along with the maldistribution of wealth, they became victims of a U.S. attack for drugs trafficking. When President Richard Nixon declared the United States a drug-free zone, he suspected countries like Venezuela, Colombia, and Peru for cocaine trafficking. Nixon would send soldiers to wipe out the manufacturing plants, injuring tens of thousands of people and the economies of the respective countries.
With all this chaos, it has caused a massive migration wave to come to the United States in search of better job opportunities and a more stable lifestyle. Latinos are the most prevalent minority group in America. This wave has triggered a political debate about illegal immigrants that still have effects in America to this day.
Latin America is an action book that is still being written by countries all over the world. To this day, there's still many global forces that shift Latin American countries economically and culturally. The Colombian exchange permanently connected both sides of the world together. Even though Spain and Portugal are considered the ex-motherlands, the two regions still hold trade diplomats in conflict resolution sessions. Even today, the region has been facing many political conflicts that result from the environment, inequality, and poverty. For example, Venezuela has a humanitarian crisis based on oil production, and Rio de Janeiro has housing communities that are neglected by the government. These factors have pushed migrants to come to the United States border, which has become a major talking point in terms on the war on drugs and illegal immigration.
With all these events and global forces combined, Latin America is a nation that is clearly on the move.